Hello and welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. We're at the Charleston Literary Festival, a gathering that seems to draw the whole city into conversation with its past and its future. Charleston is one of those rare places where history isn't something you visit, it's something you live inside. The stories are in the bricks, in the porches, in the sea light, and in the people who dedicate their lives to saving them from silence. My guest today is one of those people. Born here in the 1950s to parents who arrived after surviving the Holocaust, he grew up in a Charleston that was both beautiful and shadowed, cosmopolitan and insular, a city full of hidden lives and untold stories. And over the decades, as an archivist, historian and novelist, he's done more than almost anyone to uncover those layers. The Jewish story, the queer story, the artistic story, the Charleston Renaissance, and the quiet revolutions that shaped the Low Country. His novels have become part of the city's literary undercurrent. His non-fiction has redefined how we understand Charleston's cultural identity. And now, his latest book, Porgy's Ghost, restores Dorothy Heyward to the legacy she helped create, a legacy that still draws people from around the world to this city. And it's a privilege to meet him here, in the place that shaped him. Harlan Greene, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Oh, delighted to be here. Thank you.
We are not only in a special city, but the actual room we're sitting in is serendipitously so central to who you are and what you write about. Locate us.
So Charleston is a very small city, and history repeats not just in itself, but in spots, in geographic spots in the city of Charleston as well, too. So while we have this wonderful literary festival that's now celebrating its 10th anniversary, there are, of course, in any old city, precursors to what happened. And in the 1920s, there was a cultural renaissance in the city of Charleston, and it happened to be centered in the room that we're being interviewed in, a 19th century structure that has had so many different guises and statuses during the history of the city, now affectionately known as the Confederate home. Once was the home for Confederate widows and orphans, a tribute to the lost cause. And it was that backward glance of the lost cause that kind of paralyzed the South for a long time, looking longingly backwards to apparently a mythologized past that kept Charleston sort of frozen in time until about the 1920s, when the 20th century, for a number of reasons, belatedly enters the city, and the descendants of the plantation gentry are seeing the past being swept away in front of their eyes, and they see the modern arriving, sort of a clash between cultures and almost like climates, hot and cold coming together, stirring men's and women's souls. So this cultural efflorescence starts at about this time. And in these particular rooms where these interviews are going on, the Poetry Society of South Carolina is founded, and all of a sudden, after the Civil War, Southern literary culture starts blinking, the lights start blinking on in Charleston, South Carolina. We're certainly going to get eclipsed by the major Southern writers like William Faulkner and Eudora Welty. But truly, when Southern culture recovers after the Civil War, ironically, Charleston, the city that started the Civil War, witnesses the rebirth of culture. So the Poetry Society is giving the largest cash award for poetry published in the English language, and indeed an English woman does win that prize. Its authors go on to win Pulitzer Prizes, and I guess the most famous member of that group is Dorothy Heyward, who's an officer who would have met in the room that we're speaking in, and he brings literary fame to the city of Charleston in his novel Porgy, published in 1925. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary, and that becomes the basis of the worldwide renowned opera Porgy and Bess, set a few blocks from here.
And this is also the subject of your book, because you've written about his wife, who really has dropped from literary history. Why was she important? And tell us what you discovered in the process of writing this book.
So DuBose and Dorothy Heyward unlikely meet at the MacDowell, an artist colony in New Hampshire. They both led kind of solitary lives. He wants to be a poet. She wants to be a playwright. They sort of impetuously marry. She comes to the city of Charleston. She has fought all odds to become a writer, to become a playwright, fought her family. Her husband, on the meanwhile, is gentry of South Carolina. His direct ancestor was the signer of the Declaration of Independence. He feels he can't give up his insurance business. He can't be an artist. He has to take care of his mother. He has to take care of his sister. And it's really his wife, Dorothy, who says, in her very feminist way, you do not need to support me. Go for your dream. I myself have gone for my dream. So without her, the novel Porgy would not have been written. She had had a play fail on Broadway. He said, do not write another play. It's not good for your health. So secretly, while he was finishing the novel and reading it to her every evening, she realized the great dramatic potential of it. And not only did she transfer it to the stage, she transferred it to a much higher transcendent level. She gave the play an astonishingly moving and tragic, epic ending, which her husband had not granted his African-American hero in his novel. And so that sweeps Broadway in 1927. George Gershwin, our great American composer, is looking for, what would be the great American opera? He reads the novel Porgy one night, and it takes about 8 years, but in 1935, the opera Porgy premieres, Porgy and Bess, and it has a checkered and varied history, but it becomes probably America's best-known opera. It sweeps the world, and the opera is based on Dorothy's play, not on the novel. And Gershwin is still such a fascinating and celebratory name that as DuBose Heyward died early, George Gershwin died early, it became more and more known as the Gershwin Opera, not the Gershwin Heyward Opera. And Dorothy spent the last decades of her life making sure her husband's name was kept onto the opera, while she slowly erased her own footprints for a variety of reasons. Her DNA is all over it, her fingerprints are all over it, but she shyly hid her own contribution. And as a historian and a great lover of the opera, I think people will be curious to know how this epic work of art came to be. And it's interesting, in the opera, it's the woman Bess, the beloved, who starts all the action and then disappears from the end of the novel, and all the fallout comes. And I think Dorothy Heyward herself follows a pattern similar to that. She is the instigator of the story, and she disappears from history, and the story seems to be told without her. And I think it was time to bring her out of the footnotes into the footlights.
Absolutely fascinating. Now, this, where we are right now, is also the setting of your very first novel, Why We Never Danced the Charleston.
Truly, and it was an odd combination of fact and fiction. I was writing something else, and I was working as an archivist at the South Carolina Historical Society, trying to learn more about DuBose and Dorothy Heyward. And I met a woman who had mentored them both. She was very much like a Sybil. She was now in her 90s. She was deaf. One would ask her questions, and she would answer. You would write the questions out, and then she would answer them. So we historians now, we have all the questions that people asked her and none of the answers. But one night I was talking with her, and I was asking about Dorothy and DuBose Heyward and people of that era. And there was a very intriguing artist who had a studio in this very building named Ned Jennings, who very melodramatically killed himself in 1929 with all of his grotesque masks around the wall, with a empty champagne bottle and a Bible open in his lap. And I'd seen references to him in letters. And one night, Miss Bragg said, in her deaf, quacking woman's voice, "No, Ned Jennings did not kill himself. He was murdered by the Savannah puppeteer." And as a young man, I still get chills. I'd never heard anything quite as dramatic as that. She would never go back to the origin story. And so then my fervid imagination started working. Well, how about if I'm the Savannah puppeteer? And I say, no, Miss Bragg was wrong. I did not kill Ned Jennings, changed to Ned Grimke in the novel, and I'm going to say what really happened.
Fascinating. I mentioned at the beginning that you are the child of Holocaust survivors, and yesterday you took us on this incredible walk through the city where you explained a lot of the history. And I'm very interested in the Jewish history, because it seems like it was one of the largest Jewish populations in the United States was actually here in Charleston.
Indeed, the South is so well known stereotypically for, its beauty, its masses of enslaved people. But what's not gotten into the national story until recently is that when Carolina was founded, named the city named after Charles II, Charlestown, that it was an incredibly religiously tolerant city, except for the traditional enemies of France and Spain and their Catholic population. So for a time period in the late 1600s to the early 1700s, I do not think it's hyperbole to say that there was no more welcoming place on the planet for Jews. So Jews came here quite early. The first Jew ever to vote in North America votes in the city of Charleston in 1701. The first professing Jew elected to public office in what is now in North America is elected to office in 1774 and 1776. And in 1800, Charleston has the largest Jewish population, not per capita, but in gross numbers anywhere else in the country. And Charleston is the birthplace of American Judaism. Reform Judaism starts in this city where people have been so acculturated here for so long, they realize that for this ancient tradition to survive and for the children not to assimilate, something needs to be done to interject English into the services, interject women into the services, and adapt this religion. So it has a remarkable Jewish history.
It has a remarkable history overall. And I wondered if you could give us a sort of trot through its literary history and bringing us right up to speed to this fabulous Charleston Literary Festival.
So if we could steal something from the musical realm, maybe talk about Charleston's cultural history in kind of a sonata form. Before the American Revolution, Charleston is the wealthiest city in America and probably the most cultured. It has the best music. The first opera in America premieres in this city in the 1730s. The first purpose-built theater in what becomes in the United States is built here. So we have a city very much linked to London, very much au courant with intellectual ideas before the American Revolution. William Charles Wells will posit the theory of natural selection but in Charleston before the American Revolution, which Charles Darwin will then pick up in, decades later. So before the American Revolution, yes, we are tainted by slavery. The wealth and the culture that comes from here is on the back of enslaved Africans growing rice. But in the 19th century, things start to shift a little bit as the city becomes more defensive about defending slavery because it is the economic lifeline of the city, and England abandons and abolishes slavery, and many of the northern states abolish slavery. South Carolina retrenches, and Charleston is the intellectual center of the American South. The presses are here, the poets are here, but unfortunately, a lot of the literature and the creative energy is dissipated or spent on politics. The peculiar institution slavery is the one be-all and end-all. So you can kind of see the closing of the Southern mind is that you have to unify against slavery. And propaganda is never a good basis for literature. And so then people are so busy defending slavery that maybe they're not giving full rein to their creative genius. And so then we go down in defeat. And as I said, there's this great nostalgic looking backwards. If I could take a moment and talk about Oscar Wilde's comment about the city of Charleston. When he visited here in 1882, he delivered a lecture here, was walking along our seawall one night, remarking upon the beauty of the reflection of the moonlight on the water. He tells this episode an anecdote about the city of Charleston, where he says that he was talking to the Charlestonians about the beauty of the moon on the water, and he claims that Charlestonians turned back to him and said of the moon, "You should have seen it before the war." So he got the gestalt of the city that people were, sort of like Camelot. It never rained after sunrise. They created this myth of the Old South, and people wanted to sit there and mourn it. And we are in the home of the Confederate home, where they did take care of widows and orphans, and all the statues were being raised to the dead. People were not paying attention to the future. But again, when the 20th century belatedly enters the city of Charleston and the city starts to revive and wake up, and Dorothy Heyward writes his novel about Porgy, it's really interesting because all of a sudden now the African American becomes the basis of literature. And so then as the city opens up, it starts embracing its ethnic past and realizing that the story of Charleston, the literature of Charleston, the poetry of Charleston, the music of Charleston is not just of the elite white English descended, but it is a melting pot of a variety of cultures. And the beautiful irony is the great American opera is set in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, which started the Civil War. The libretto, based on a novel written by a Southern aristocrat about a real-life beggar, black beggar, who walked the streets of Charleston, turned into an opera by sons of Jewish immigrants. So it's, the opera itself is a great metaphor, and I think it also stands for the growth of the literature and the literary history and the literary importance of this place.
And obviously we see this today in the festival here, which is going to celebrate its 10th year next year. We've just come through the 9th. It was a huge success. You are not only a featured author at the festival, but you're also a donor. And I'm fascinated by this powerhouse of a woman, Suzanne Pollock, who encourages people in this very wealthy city to fund the festival. Why does it get so much support? It really seems to me that the residents here are 100% behind this, and you're one of them.
Charleston has managed to attract, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, very discriminating people who realize the uniqueness of this city. They are what we call Charlestonians by choice, maybe do not have the lineage, but certainly have the love of the place. And they see the importance of our cultural institutions, and they support our cultural institutions. And they know what a gem that this festival is, and it is worth supporting. Charleston has numbers of festivals, food and wine, the Spoleto Festival, which features art, opera, dance. And the literary aspect of culture is one that had never been celebrated per se. Yes, a library will have a series of authors. Charleston is home to authors. Many famous authors live part-time here. But I think it was a wonderful combination of the moment and the woman and the people involved that, we'll be talking about this origin story at some point, that this incredible festival came over from England, from the Charleston Festival there. We have luxuriant soil here, and it seems that the literary festival, the seed that dropped here, was remarkably adapted to the soil here, and I think people realize the specialness of this festival. And sure, you pay for beauty, you pay for a great mansion in the city of Charleston, you pay for the amenities, and you're proud of them, and so then the festival, to some extent, is one of the best things of the city.
I couldn't agree with you more. I want to talk just a little bit more about your own work and life, because you've led major archival departments, from the County Library to the Avery Research Centre to special collections. I wonder what are some of the key discoveries or projects that you've found that have helped fill the gaps in the city's history?
Well, it's interesting how history and our perception of history has changed over time. Historically, I think of history as was an elite white man's club, and so then they were the ones who had all the power. When they founded the archives, they're the ones that filled their archives with their papers reflecting their interest. And it's so interesting now these days with archival science trying to fill in the margins. Archives have, we've had archives in this city, a library since the 1740s, an archive since the 1850s. Not until the 1970s or 80s have we had an African American archive in the city of Charleston. A Jewish archive has founded after that, queer archive after that. So I think parallel, chicken and the egg, which comes first, is our rediscovering of our history driving the culture to being more multicultural, or is the multiculturalism of our culture making us realize, that, we have to reflect our past? It's a really interesting dynamic. We don't know what drives what, but there does seem to be an awakening and a maturation and a sophistication of realizing there's more than one narrative here in this city, and there are multiple narratives. And I think that's reflected in the Literary Festival as well, too.
One of your works, What the Dead Remember, is a book that captures a particular time and a particular gay Charleston. I know you've been incredibly instrumental in LGBT rights here, and also just in making sure that history is not forgotten. Tell me more about your role and that book.
So that is set in Charleston in the 1950s, and it's kind of reflective of the city itself, of how making one mistake in the past can haunt a place forever. We were very much addicted to slavery, which brings on the Civil War. And I found a metaphor there. This was written in the 1980s in the height of the AIDS crisis, and my first partner did succumb to AIDS. But I don't know if it was the historian in me or the gay man in me or the survivor. I'm the child of survivors. I could see certainly parallels between the Holocaust and what was happening to, gay young men. But it also struck me that with AIDS, it was somewhat of a similar metaphor, is that one gay man could have had one chance encounter with the virus, and that determined his life or took his life. So I'm not sure I was quite aware of that when I was writing the novel, but it struck me, that centered in the city of Charleston. And I think I preface that novel with an extract from an 1863 poem by Henry Timrod, where basically the city is on the verge of being taken in the Civil War, and is it, all untroubled in her faith, she waits the triumph or the tomb. And it struck me in that time period of AIDS, not knowing what was going to happen, that there seemed to be a parallel situation going on in the city at the time.
And what about now? Is the LGBT world celebrated, encouraged, tolerated? How would you say it functions within the city now?
Charleston is a very liberal city, possibly in a very conservative state. We use colors to determine that. We're a blue city and a red state. And I see so many more, young gay men and women in positions of power. We just elected an openly black gay city councilman to our city council. So yes, and this is an artistic city. It is a seacoast city. So gay life is vibrant here. I did write a history of the gay life in the city of Charleston too. And it was astonishing to find that yes, there are holes in history and there are silences, but there have been incredibly important, both locally and nationally, events associated with LGBTQ history here as well too. So, there are LGBTQ tours, and I think there's a very strong, visible LGBTQ presence here. You'll find the Ukrainian flag flying here, you'll find the rainbow flag flying here, and less you'll find the Confederate flag flying here.
So you were born here in 1953?
Indeed.
How has the city changed? You are a Charleston boy through and through.
I was lucky enough to be born here. I was very fortunate to have known and have always worked in the field of history and have known remarkable, and it's generally always women, who have kept the historic tradition alive. So I feel very fortunate to have remember a smaller Charleston, a more insular Charleston, a certainly shabbier Charleston, but a more genteel city, versus the very dynamic, possibly overdeveloped, possibly over-touristed city of today. And change is inevitable, and I embrace it. We did not have this literary festival when I was growing up. The city was still segregated when I was growing up. So I embrace the change, but I'm very happy to have the memories of walking by a place that's now developed and spit-shined and elegant, and I can remember kind of a seedy, kind of perhaps more authentic, but certainly less glamorous aspect of the city. So to some extent, time travel. It's wonderful to have seen that change, and I'm fortunate to have lived long enough to have seen it all.
I mean, I was very, very struck, particularly on the tour with you, that every single street, every single building on every single street is beautiful, has been restored. It's all got some kind of history usually posted up outside it. So there was a time when actually that wasn't the case. Places did fall into disrepair, and it's just really over the last few years that it's come back to life.
Right, so when Charleston does punch above its weight in many ways, we didn't just start a civil war, but the city of Charleston actually, for this country, invents the field of preservation. So after the Civil War, we were incredibly poor, and there was no industry here, so that's why no buildings were torn down. There's very few Victorian buildings in the city of Charleston. There was no economic engine driving the economy here, so the city sat and did not change until the 1920s come along. During World War I, tourists are not going to Europe or to England, they're coming to Florida, stopping through the city of Charleston. The first line in DuBose Heyward's novel describing Charleston in Porgy, he calls it an ancient, beautiful city that time forgot before it destroyed. So when people started, quote, quote, discovering Charleston, they found a very shabby place. I often liken it to Havana, abandoned by international tourists for 60 years. And when it finally opens up, it's incredibly beautiful to the eye, incredibly shabby, and incredibly inexpensive. So people start flocking here for all those reasons. And we made our mistakes. We started selling ourselves. We had no manufacturing goods. So we started to become a tourist city. And so then we started tearing down old buildings to build hotels and gas stations, service stations, petrol stations for cars. And then in 1931, we came to our senses. We realized that Charleston was killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And it was at that point that we realized what had survived through sheer luck, now we had to band together and preserve it. So the Preservation Society, the first grassroots organization in America, is founded in 1920. And in 1931, the city of Charleston passes the first zoning law that protects historic architecture, that says you cannot tear down a building of a certain age without permission, alter things that can be seen from the street without BAR, Board of Architectural Review approval. So any law in the United States that has an impact like that is based on the 1931 Charleston Ordinance. So we do face existential crises. The sea is rising. We're very similar to Venice in many ways, that we are so beautiful and so popular that so many people want to come here. So we're facing gentrification. We're facing rising seas. We're facing, an 18th and 19th century city with needing 21st century infrastructure. But there is that same legacy, that love of that legacy. We realize that by sheer luck and through some determination, this beautiful city has survived, and it's not going to take luck to keep it surviving. It's going to take a lot of grit and determination. And many of the same people who fund the festival also fund the preservation of this city.
It's wonderful how important then the city really is to everybody. You feel a part of it. Even as a visitor, I find myself being sucked in.
I mean, it does have a certain character. It's, for a city of its impact, it's remarkably small and compact. So it is a very walkable city. It's, in parts of it, neighborhoods, very 18th century city, then very 19th century, and it's still a living city as well, too. So, it's certainly like going to, maybe Rye in England. You see this charming city, and you can't help but feel the past as you walk down the streets. The ghosts are still there, the shadows are literally being cast, and so then you can't help but wonder. But I think that's the nature of art as well, too. I mean, the aesthetics of the city, the beauty of the city evokes something. It has evoked something, in our past literary artists, and it certainly evokes something in the present visitors as well. And again, I think maybe that's why it's in great marriage between the authors who come here, because they're not coming to a major city where they're going to have to take a taxi from a hotel to a convention center. You see the authors walking from one venue to another, or from where they're staying to another. So it does have a very intimate feel, and it's a very seductive city. It's a very beautiful city. We do have a very tumultuous past. Charleston looks like a gracious lady who has aged very elegantly, but we do have to realize that she's had a rather dark primary color past. She may have faded to pastel colors today, and I think that's kind of evident. You can try to put blinders on, but I believe we're getting better at saying where this beauty came from. A truism that I always like to throw out is, in England we say Anonymous was a woman, and I think in the American South we have to say Anonymous was an African American. These great unsigned beautiful buildings may have held the lives of elite white people, but they were fashioned by African American hands. And today people literally do look in the bricks looking for the thumbprint specifically of the small African American children who pressed their thumbs into those bricks and somehow sort of anonymously signed these great mansions.
Harlan Greene, thank you so much. So fascinating. Porgy's Ghost is published by the University of Georgia Press, joining a remarkable body of work by Harlan that charts the human and artistic history of Charleston with depth, honesty and affection. And here at the Charleston Literary Festival, which exists thanks to the vision and generosity of its donors and to the people who believe that this city's stories matter, it feels especially fitting to hear those histories told by one of their great custodians. Harlan Greene, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much. What a pleasure.
You've been listening to Meet the Writers. Thanks also to my producer, Steph Chungu. And you can hear this programme again and indeed have access to our entire archive wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.